2, 1. All right, video is started. All right, so in this unit, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on fallacies, right? Now, a fallacy, let me spell that word for you, right? A fallacy is a mistake in reasoning, right? It's a mistake in reasoning. Mistake in reasoning or argument or argumentation. We'll say that. All right, but it's a mistake. Now, there's two types of formal fallacies. And this first section will delineate between two types. And it's rather short because we spend all the rest of the unit learning about all the informal fallacies, and we only pay attention to formal fallacy during this little lecture, right? So a formal fallacy is a mistake in terms of its form. So, and immediately what should jump to mind is section 1.4. Formal fallacy is technically equals using an invalid structure. So recall the chart with all the invalid cousins, right? So a formal fallacy is trying to pass off an informal fallacy, an informal argumentative structure as if it were better than it is, right? So in a sense, you're trying to it's kind of like how Danny DeVito in Matilda, that kids movie, right? Like slaps together cars with super glue. Remember, the bumper falls off and there's little things that super glue. He goes and then just puts it back on. But he makes the cars, he's cheating people, right? So in a sense, you're trying to pass off a good piece of reasoning as if it was a valid piece of argumentation. That's the reason why it's a fallacy. So technically, not only did you have to recall the definition of validity from 1.4, and this is an example of how the course builds on with previous concepts, right? But actually using an invalid argument form as if it's good reasoning is technically formal fallacy. So let's actually go to the example of the book, right? So let me see here. I'll go to share my screen. And here we are with the example from the book. Let me make it a little bigger, right? I don't know if that works. Oh, right here. Right. So our book says a formal fallacy is one that may be identified by merely examining the form or structure of an argument. And fallacy of this kind are found only in deductive arguments. And you know that by definition because the concept validity and invalidity is a property of deductive arguments only, right? So when you take a look at this little example right here, all bullfights are grotesque rituals. All executions are grotesque rituals. Therefore, all bullfights are executions. Now, this actually looks like a really good argument, right? I don't necessarily know if you know this. The Spanish tradition of bullfighting is one in which you do fight a bull, and the bullfighters throw daggers into the actual animal. So it's a very cruel thing. And so, bullfights are grotesque rituals. Maybe you find that grotesque, that they actually are killing a male bull, right? For the purposes of entertainment. And they are throwing real knives into it, right? And all executions are grotesque rituals. Therefore, all bullfights are executions. Now, but remember, so does this look familiar to you? So we called this the middle term, right? Or at least, there's the word at the end. And I may have said to a class or two previously, but you know this as the invalid argumentative structure because look at the position of these words. Now let me go back to about, what's page 48 or so, right? Let me just go back. Deductive arguments. Here we go, right? So take a look here, word plants and plants. These are invalid. So that actually has the same form as every single argument in this column, right? So go back again. I'm sorry, 144 is the P. Yeah, so, right, with this one right here, again, the words rituals are at the end. So really, honestly, so formal fallacy, again, is passing off an invalid structure inside a deductive argument. And this is the only fallacy of form that we have, right? And because form is an important concept that attaches itself to deductive argumentation, that's right there. The rest, all right, and so this argument has the following form. Again, that is an invalid form. This one right here, right, if we were to go to that same chart, this would be the invalid cousin of modus ponens, called affirming the consequent, right? You can't do this, and this is the invalid structure, and you're trying to pass it off as a good modus ponens when that's not the case, right? So using the wrong form is violating the norm of form, right? Sorry, I rhymed that on purpose, right? But, following these patterns, right? You would not want to receive a football with and insist to your football coach that you catch the ball one-handed all the time, because you're going to fumble and cause a turnover, and we might lose the game because you can't follow the form of how to catch the ball, tuck, and protect, right? In terms of football. So following the form is a sort of regulative practice that helps us avoid mistakes, otherwise known as fallacies. Now, the other concept here, and let me stop sharing this for a second, go back out here. The other one is called informal fallacies, right? So informal fallacies are always about the content of an argument. So in learning, and so there's about 22 fallacies from section 3.1 to 3.4 that we review. And of those 22, maybe 2 or 3 actually have some sub-varieties. So it's a little bit more closer to 30 if we, so ad populum has about like 5 or 6 sub-varieties. Ad hominem, or against the person, has like 3 sub-varieties, and I actually ask you to memorize the sub-varieties that are underneath those fallacies as well. There's close to 30 informal fallacies. So what happens is, in the next section, the homework is they give you examples of reasoning in each of the different sections. You have to map on by definition which fallacy is occurring and where. And that's also the testing skill that I'm going to test in this chapter as well. So informal fallacies commands more of our attention than formal fallacy. And this is probably why, this is really a 10-minute lecture, the 3.1, right? So because of that, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to review the distinction between informal fallacy and formal fallacy. I'm going to throw in the homework review for this as well. So right now, pause if you haven't done the homework. Pause to consider. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to go over the homework, right? And I know for those watching the video, there's like this pause. You're like, did that really even work? I know, right? But we're going to test the distinction between formal fallacy and informal fallacy. Now, when you take a look at this homework, and we're only going to do a few of these, there's only about 10 problems or so, and we'll do a little bit. This is going to be the only time during a video production where I lump the lecture and the homework review together, because it's such a simple distinction, right? Informal fallacy, you don't even know the names of these yet. So what the homework is going to do is going to ask you to distinguish between formal fallacy and informal fallacy. And each time that, we encounter these, I'll explain why. But at the same time, right, what really we're doing is we're tracking the distinction of invalid forms versus valid forms. And I've given you some ones to sort of memorize with the chart inside Moodle, as well as, some examples in the book from sections 1.3 when we review various types of deductive arguments, right? So this is all going to look a little familiar from Unit 1. And again, this is how the course builds on itself. But the concept of validity is the thing that goes through all the units in the course, right? It's the most important distinction between valid and invalid. But it is a form distinction versus a content distinction, right? So this one tracks the form of reasoning, and it only occurs with invalid patterns. That's the only time that you actually commit the formal fallacy. Other than that, they're all content-based, and we're going to write informal fallacy as that as well. And now after this unit, what you could do is you could come back to this homework in 3.1 and take a look and see, oh, well, that's this particular fallacy right here, Dr. Hackett. And of course, right, that's what you're meant to do. But right now, we're just going to track the distinction between formal and informal. And let me go back and share the textbook. What you're going to see is this is a very short homework, right? We're literally only 10 problems, right? All right. So if Rasputin was really mad, then he deceived Tsar Nicholas II. Rasputin was not really mad, therefore he did not deceive Tsar Nicholas II. Now, you're noticing here, you're noticing a pattern. At least I hope you're noticing a pattern, right? And of course, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to follow this out on the board here, even though you can't see it. I know that it's the limit of the technology, but like what I like to do is I like to write out and have this visual reference for when I can get rid of it, right? So you need to decide, is this a formal fallacy or informal fallacy, right? So determine whether the fallacies committed by the following arguments are formal and informal, right? So they're tracking the distinction. So you know immediately that you should be able to infer that there's going to be no tricky ones here. There's going to be no real good ones, right? They're all fallacies. So is this first one, so if Rasputin was really mad, I'll say if M, because it got the word mad in it, then he deceived Tsar Nicholas II. So then D, and I'll just do that for the whole sentence, right? Now, a proper modus tollens will negate the consequent on the second line, right? And this is technically our second line. Rasputin was not really mad. So what we're doing actually is we are negating the antecedent instead. So we're going not M, therefore not D. So now hopefully you see that this is a deviation from modus tollens. And if it's a deviation of modus tollens, then is this a formal fallacy or informal fallacy? Pause to consider. Yes, it's a violation of form. In being a violation of form, it is a formal fallacy. It's attempting to pass off the bad version of modus tollens as if it's good, right? Now, number two is really, I do love number two a lot, right? Everything that runs has feet. Okay, that makes sense to me, right? We're going to say the Mississippi River because on campus in the BR, right? We're right on the bluff. We're right next to the Mississippi. So let's just change that just for fun. So everything that runs has feet. The Mississippi runs very swiftly. Therefore, the Mississippi River has feet. Wait, what just happened here? So why is this a bad piece of reasoning? Pause to consider. So did you notice that we have two different definitions of the verb run here? Or maybe what we might say is two linguistic expressions that use run in two different ways. Running as the physical activity implies that you have legs to run, right? Everything from deer to my cat to me, we can all run because we have feet. But we also use the expression runs very swiftly. That means like, you know, something pours very like a very viscous liquid is moving very quickly, right? Or the river has a lot of motion to it, right? So again, we're using the word run in two different senses. There's no notion of form here whatsoever. So number two is a really good example of, pause to consider, that's right, informal, right? So now, go down to number three. Is this a formal or informal fallacy? I won't go over anything quite yet to lead you astray. You just consider this one on your own. Pause to consider. Did you notice that the phrase in line 1 and line 2 both end with the predicate term is titled people who lack social responsibility. So because it has the middle term at the end, it's the same violation of form that we saw in that chart, but we also saw right here with the word ritual, right? It was just a more complicated version of that form. And so hopefully you got formal fallacy for number 3, right? Number 4 is an interesting one. The ship of state is like a ship at sea. No sailor is ever allowed to protest orders from the captain. For the same reason, no citizen should ever be allowed to protest presidential policies. Pause to consider. So, did you get the fact that there's no form here that we're aware of? So if there's no formal violation of rules, then what is it? Pause to consider. It's informal fallacy, that's right. Now, the particular informal fallacy here, we don't have a word for this quite yet, but this is the fallacy of false analogy, right? It's not actually analogous. Like sailors to a captain is a different structure than from any of us as US citizens protesting some action the government has taken, right? In fact, as citizens, the survival of our democracy may depend upon citizens being contentious against the government violating some principle of liberty. And we might have a better country for the protests. So part of you and I being citizens is to, have grievances about what the government is doing, make them known, and share them with the First Amendment, right? We're allowed to do that. However, if you're a sailor in the Navy or you're part of the Merchant Marines, the captain, there's a hierarchical structure. There's like maybe 10 people aboard a ship and there's a clear line of command, right? And you're not allowed to question the orders of a captain. So they're two different things. They're not similar to each other. So the analogy doesn't hold, and it's a content-based type thing. And that's why we say that that's an informal fallacy, right? So I'll do one more in terms of this section, and then I'll give you like 6 through 10 to practice with. So renowned violinist Pinchas Zuckerman has said, "When it comes to vodka, Smirnoff plays second fiddle to none. We must therefore conclude that Smirnoff is the best vodka available." So now, this section or unit, you have to ask yourself, is there a form being violated in number 5? Pause to consider. No, there is no form that we're available to, right? Now, Pinchas Zuckerman, right? This is a form of the ad populum fallacy, that simply because a celebrity endorses a product or says something true to get you to accept the conclusion. Notice here there's no premises or evidence that Smirnoff vodka is the best vodka available. And there's no transparency about the metrics we're using to measure these preferences as to why Smirnoff is the best form of vodka, etc. Right? So clearly, we don't really have any evidence for the conclusion, and we just have the testimony of one person, right? And that person is a violinist. That person is not like a connoisseur of hard liquor or anything. A person, right? So anyway, celebrity endorsements are a form of fallacy if that's all that's being presented to you as to why you should buy/use that product, right? A way that would not be a fallacy is if maybe we had like a consumer reports issue that tried to measure people's preferences in terms of what they actually thought was the best vodka, right? So maybe an empirical survey of people at like an alcohol trade convention show, maybe there's some sort of evidence to that we could measure preferences. And maybe that's how we might determine what the best vodka is. But that would be a systematic survey of people who drink these hard liquors and are aware of all the different varieties. Or maybe we do like a taste testing study. Like you know, and maybe at the trade show, what we're doing is we're trying to determine what the best brands are. The point is there's a way to ask question 5 that's more responsible than simply saying that a famous violinist endorsed our product, that therefore you should buy it. But, you know, right. So when Simone Weil appears on the frosted, not the frosted, but the what's the cereal? Wheaties, the Wheaties box, right? When she appears on the Wheaties box, the people that make that cereal are trying to be like, I will be a strong gymnast like her if I eat this cereal. And that's not necessarily a rational argument as to why you should eat that cereal, but people who play with commercials don't actually have to be rational to establish those positive associations with celebrities, right? So if LeBron James is on the Wheaties box, right, and I want to play basketball as well as LeBron James, therefore I should eat this cereal, that's a really bad argument, right? The premises don't really relate to the conclusion. There's no evidence that eating Wheaties will make you like LeBron James, but the company just wants to establish that relationship, right? So again, this is a content informal fallacy. And of course, you know, unless you studied, you know, the fallacies of weak analogy or, you know, the ad populum fallacy, you're not going to get these as to what they're named, but you will be able to come back to this argument afterwards. So those are just some examples that track the difference between formal fallacy and informal fallacy. And I'm going to stop the video now before producing. But again, this is the only video where the homework review is contained in tracking that distinction. Thank you for listening. And again, keep thinking logically.